How are you?
Doing well. How about yourself?
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, no, I got a lot more out of the paper since Wednesday. I've been chipping away at it. Really interesting. I had no idea that neuroscientists had spent so much time trying to prove prospectivity in brains. Apparently, that's a thing. So,
well, I'm not sure. Yeah, I have to look at that research. Seeing that decision making is associated with one part of neural activity. I'm not sure how much we really get out of that.
I don't know either. It's a good question.
It's kind of like, I think it generally works better to eat with our hands than our feet.
Yeah, no, that is one of the problems with trying to span such huge chasms. Is that it gets pretty speculative. I'll be the first to admit, but
so that's okay. That's how this stuff starts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give, hopefully some more people will show up. Payan can't make it today, sadly, but so be it. Oh man.
Yeah, do you see that those comments I sent you this morning?
I did, yeah. So there's a comment in the paper. I can bring it up. Actually, that's probably a good thing for me to do, just to bring up the paper. Where is it? I had a separate panel for it. This one, and then the paper itself. Oh, Rose is here. Welcome. Welcome.
Sorry, good morning.
Hey. Good morning for you guys, at least.
Oh, sorry, Rob. Good afternoon.
Afternoon. Yeah, this is the one. So I want to switch it over to this guy and drop that and forward. Cool. All righty. So I'm hoping Robin will join us. He would be a very interesting person to talk to about this because he spent a lot of time in the RL space. So I'll wait a few minutes for him. Okay, so if I go to share and share.
It might just be a busy weekend for people too.
Of course. Yeah, no question. All right, we are at 2 minutes past. I give them 3 more minutes. How are things going with you, Rose?
Good. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. Busy, very busy. A lot of end of year stuff and but yeah, it's good. I'm enjoying it. What about you?
Very interesting. Yeah, so I've been working with Rob on so I was chatting with my friend Chris Wisinger yesterday, and he came up with the idea of, so he's been reading The Enigma of Reason. That's a book that we haven't touched on for a little while, but he's completely moved by it, and his brain is exploding. He suggested reasonable agents in contrast to rational agents. So essentially what he is suggesting is rather than trying to create things that maximize utility according to economics or according to Sutton's reinforcement learning, that if we kind of adopt agents that behave in a Kahneman-Tversky kind of way minimally, and hopefully we can add more nuance to those agents later, they cease being rational at that point. And so the term that he came up with, which I actually quite like, is reasonable agents.
So explain the distinction to me. So you're using some other method.
So that's the paper. So we'll go through this.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, that's what the paper is basically covering.
Yeah.
which is the idea that human beings don't exhibit rational behavior. They do exhibit predictable behavior, but they don't exhibit rational behavior.
And a lot of this comes back to the a priori structures that we've created. Would you agree with that?
I've thought a lot about a priori. So yeah, we can get into that a little bit later, but yes. I can get into the brain structure I'm working on for my agents a little bit, if that's of interest to the group. We can cover that a bit later on. Okay, I think I'll get rolling. It's 9:35, so if others want to watch, they can just watch the video. So I'll just go through. I've got a very kind of compact version of the paper that we can hopefully get through pretty quickly, but feel free, of course, to jump in if you have any questions. All right. So this is my understanding of the experimental design. So they basically came up with this game. All right, and this game is a simple lookup table. It's a multi-step gambling game. There is an underlying distribution that is randomized with a function, a distribution, right? So you never get to see the underlying process. You only get to see the underlying process plus some random value drawn from a distribution of some kind. Okay, and the idea is that using reinforcement learning, people can usually pick up on the underlying pattern in about 20 games, and then they discard the first 20 games, and then they essentially record the latter 60 games that the human beings played, assuming that they have some intuitive understanding of the underlying system. And then they trained a bunch of agents using what they call risk-sensitive reinforcement learning with the same experiment to see if they would exhibit similar results, right?
So can I just clarify that I'm understanding? So they took a group of people, had the people play the game, we discarded the first 20 games of that, and then used the data following to train them all?
Yeah, that's right. And the assumption was that after 20 games, the people would have a kind of an intuitive, pretty good guess, and they did. Okay, so right, so we start with a fixed game where the outcomes are all predefined a priori, except for some risk, which is sampled from a known distribution. I covered that. Agents learn the best strategy over time, given some utility function. This is a key component. The shape of the utility function has a statistically significant effect on the behavior of the agent, right? So different agents that have different utility functions behave differently. Kind of not a very profound insight, but actually it's pretty interesting. So they tried a bunch of,
isn't it? Because we assume all the time that there's a single utility function, but there isn't.
There isn't.
Yeah.
And that's what, so they call it, so the way that they characterize this is something that they call time difference, or TD error. So theoretically, a rational agent would make the same decision given any context, so long as the information affecting the decision is the same. And so their way of talking about the contextual effect of in decision making is to essentially call it this kind of time difference error, or TD error. Okay, so at this time, I made the error, because we should all be rational, of making this choice, but in fact, due to the context around me, I made this other choice. So they explore a number of different utility functions, and so this is the interesting finding. So agents trained using risk-sensitive RL exhibited a behavioral match with 30 people who performed the same task over 80 iterations. And as I said, they discarded the first 20 as being learning or exploration, and then the latter 60 would be exploitation. So
can you tell me those numbers again? 30 people out of 80 were similar?
No, so 30 people, I'll show you the results in a minute, but basically 30 people took the experiment. So you have to lie inside an fMRI machine and look at a screen that has these pictures on the left here shown to you. and you have to make rational, well, quote unquote, rational choices about the multi-stage thing that you go through here on the right. All right, so you're lying inside an fMRI machine. There's a screen in front of you, and you can make choices. And as you make these choices, you progress through this flow chart on the right, and you do that 80 times. Okay, so there's a completely separate body of research which has nothing to do specifically with machine learning at all, where a bunch of neuroimaging specialists essentially set up a prospect theory-like experiments on human subjects and measured their brain activity, and have identified 2 areas in the brain that are associated with decision-making, and that's a separate body of literature. I don't have access to it. It's behind the paywall, so I couldn't read it. But Kahneman and Tversky really come at it from the kind of empirical side. The fMRI guys essentially, I think there's 3 separate papers that they talk about, have identified that there are particular neural regions associated with the decision-making process. Yeah, so once again, so that what they're doing here is they're drawing on different bodies of knowledge, and they're trying to synthesize them together. There's actually very little newness in the paper, but they're essentially strengthening somewhat intuitive correlations with data and with explanation as best they can. Anyway, so these guys did their own fMRI study. I've already talked about that. And so that's the claim is that risk-sensitive RL is a better paradigm for exploring human agent behavior over other utility functions, right? So they're saying that if you give your agent a TD error that is similar to Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory loss aversion utility function, your agents will act more human-like than otherwise. So that's my understanding of the paper in general. So let's look at this.
The presumption is we want to be human-like, huh?
The presumption is that we want to create human-like agents. That's a very good question. That's a very good question, and I'll defer on that one for now. I just want to try and blaze through this. So this is directly from Kahneman and Tversky's paper. And what they found was, and I'll go through this, is that rather than a rational agent would not essentially add any bias to the underlying utility function at all. So they would be this kind of straight line here, right? So they would not be moved by some new information or contextual information that apparently doesn't have any effect on.
What are on the axes of that?
I'll come back to that. I've got better axes later on.
Okay.
I'm just trying to say that the paper that we're looking at didn't come up with this curve. It actually comes from Kahneman and Tversky. That's all I'm trying to say. So the one to look at is over here on the right. So this is from the paper. So there's a mathematical section of the paper where they come up with these different derivations. And there are different mathematical models. Let's just very quickly jump and gain an intuition of this. What are they talking about? Okay. So if I have a fair coin toss, right? I have a fair coin and I toss it, and I'm asked to make, are you going to bid on this being a head or not? Technically, the result should be the weighted probability should be the same as the underlying probability, right? So the weighted probability is half, right? So the agent perceives that it is a fair coin. If the agent is risk-seeking, then according to this upper curve here, this black curve, this RS means risk-seeking, the agent is distorting reality. And the way the term I use is the reality distortion field. They're having the same perceptions as the other agents, but they're applying this internal weighting function that is distorting their view of reality. So they would suggest in their own mind that the likelihood that the coin would be the value that they choose to be 72%. A risk-averse person would think that it's only 28%. And then there are these two curves. And I just want to point out that on the left here, we have the Kahneman and Tversky curve, right? So we have this curve, and you can see it here, right? You can see this dotted line here. That is also the Kahneman and Tversky curve. And what they've done is they've explored a truly risk seeking behavior at the top, a truly risk-averse behavior at the bottom, and then this Kahneman and Tversky mix, which has this kind of transition probability, and then the mirror of the Kahneman and Tversky prospect theory curve, right? So if we go back to...
Does that mean that for low outcomes, you're risk averse for, or sorry, for really uncertain outcomes, you're risk averse, for more certain outcomes, you're less risk averse?
No, it's literally mapping, I'm going to win, or I'm not going to win, based on a fair coin, which doesn't make any sense, but that's the research, right?
Personalities as opposed to anything else.
Right, or past conditioning, or whatever you want to call it, but yes, or context. If I walk into a casino and everyone's kind of really upset and hitting the machine saying, oh, I'm not going to gamble. But if I walk into a casino and I hear ding, 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 and everyone's going, yay, I'm going to start gambling, right? The odds haven't changed. Mm-hmm. Okay, so context matters is the point. And they talk about this in the paper, it's very interesting. Anyway, what the point I'm trying to get to here is that given the same underlying system.
Can I interrupt for a second, David? When you're saying context matter, but in this case, all of the agents would have had the same context. So it's not really context, it's the agent perspective that matters.
I know, but the agent's perspective is informed by not a priori in terms of like the beginning of everything, but before now, right? Their past experience that led them to this point has led them to have a particular bias when it comes to risk sensitivity, that's all.
Right, but in this particular situation, because it's closed world, the context is shared across everyone.
There's no difference in the underlying system.
Okay.
No, none at all.
All right.
Right, they're all seeing the same world through different glasses, right?
Okay, thank you.
That's fine. Yeah, so Kahneman and Tversky say that if you are offered a coin toss, you actually wouldn't say it's a fair bet. You would assume that you would lose by a bit. So we have an inherent kind of risk averseness, which even given a completely fair coin toss, we are likely to come under a little bit, like 41 and 0.41 as opposed to, oops, that's a typo, I'll fix that. Sorry. Yeah, so the prospect theory suggests that even at 0.5, your average human would think that it's a scam, right? And then mix 2, which is the mirror image of Kahneman and Tversky, predicts even lower at 0.31. Once again, I'm just trying to give you an intuition of what this curve means and what it's doing. That's all. And these different kind of mappings that they put on top of the underlying utility cause the agents to exhibit different behavior when performing the task. So let's go back to this picture. All right, so on the left now, yeah, we have X and then U of X. So this is a different, this is just essentially a mathematical transformation of this thing on the left into this on the right. I won't go into that too much. You can read the paper for details, but I think I've got the main point across. Okay, so in order to introduce this kind of reality distortion field, they had to modify the MDP a bit. So they went from the classical MDP, which is the one on the left, Markov decision process, to what they call a risk-sensitive MDP on the right. And this is basically the fundamental contribution of this paper, which is the idea of introducing risk sensitivity into the Markov decision process. So on the right here, we have the classic environment where the environment issues a reward and an updated state back to the agent. The agent then chooses to take some action, which changes the environment, and around we go. On the right, it's a little bit different. The environment does generate the underlying value, but this underlying value is actually used to drive the reality distortion field, which essentially changes the reward, right? So based on your context, that changes the time difference, and thus the reward will be altered by your current context, even though the environment doesn't care. And then that will drive your policy. So you are learning through your distorted lens of the world, not from the underlying system. If that makes sense. So
Interesting way of putting it, yeah.
So by applying a utility function to the temporal difference error, nonlinear transformations are effectively applied not only to the received rewards, but to the true transition probabilities of the underlying Markov decision process. So you're making decisions based on your distorted view of the world.
Can you clarify just for a second again what's feeding into that? Is that basically, I have won 5 times, so now I think I'm going to win again, or however many times it is, that the play so far, my play so far, has given me a certain risk aversion or an appetite.
Let's say I randomly, so this comes out in the results, and we'll come to this in a minute. Maybe I'll bring up the results. So that's this one. Okay. All right, so let's look at this picture here. All right, so of the 30 subjects, right, 17 randomly chose to be risk seeking, and they were rewarded for that. Oh, you know, I said, I'm going to gamble everything, you know. Oh, I won. Hooray. Oh, I'll try that again. Oh, and so the underlying thing is that if you take risks, you'll win. And if you don't take risks, you'll lose. But you don't know that when you start, right? That's completely hidden. And that's what your reinforcement learning is trying to establish. Is this a rigged game in the negative? Is this a rigged game in the positive? I don't know. I'll play a few times, try and work out what it is. And then I can make some money or I can lose some money. And what they found was that one group of agents, 17 in fact, found the path to the reward being associated with risk taking. And so they chose to take lots of risks and got the maximum reward. All right, so that shows that they found the benefit of the system. You know, they essentially gained the system by understanding it. But 6 subjects had a negative series of outcomes and stayed there, right? So they became risk averse. So their state, if you will, moved to one of pessimism as opposed to optimism by the reinforcement learning. I played a game, I lose. Oh, I played a game, I lose. Oh, I played a game, I lose. Oh, I'm always going to lose, right? So they are conditioned. These people were conditioned into taking risk by the underlying reinforcement learning system. These agents were conditioned into being risk averse, and then there was a few random, you know, people who didn't stop exploring and tried all sorts of different things throughout all the trials.
How do we know it was experience as opposed to just the people coming into it? Is there a way that we've controlled for that, or?
Good question. I would come back with principle of induction, which is
Probably not.
Probably not. Yeah. Good question. Once again, I'm just trying to give you a quick. So
yeah, no, it's great. I mean, I think it's really interesting. It's just those pieces of, is it what they learned in this specific case, or is it something that's much bigger than that, right?
There's actually very little detail in the paper, to be honest.
Yeah. Can you go back to that previous one for a sec?
Sure. That was which one? Sorry, this one.
The outcome. Previous slide you had up. No, it was the different outcomes, the 17 and.
Oh, that's on the different paper. Sorry, this one. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So that group of 17, was this based off of changing the experiments to generate?
My understanding is that other than the random sampling, like the jitter that they introduce so that you can't sample the underlying utility function directly, just to make it harder to kind of interpret, it's identical.
But I guess my question is, okay, so they did basically a whole bunch of coin flips.
Let's say, yeah.
60 trials, okay.
Sequentially, right? 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, now that group is 17. Was the experiment skewed to make the outcomes more favorable?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the underlying distribution was, and I can show you that. That's a good question. Yeah, so if you look over here on the right, you'll see that agents, the expected value of taking path 1 is 90, right? That's very good. The expected value of taking path 4, the pessimistic path, is actually negative. You actually end up losing, right? So, and this is baked, right? This is all baked in. This doesn't change, it's all a priori. This is experimental design phase, right? So, yeah, so there's this kind of rigged system that the people are trying to learn through experience. And they're trying to work out what preferences they have, they generate during that learning process. And they compare that to the expected utility, they compare that to Sutton's reinforcement learning thing, and they compare it to Kahneman and Tversky and flipped Kahneman and Tversky. That's the 4 different motifs they explore. And these are the kind of the baked in results. Okay, so what that picture I was showing you here is saying is that 17 people worked out over a series of 20 trials that if they take the risk-seeking option, both at all 3 stages, they'll get the maximum reward. Right. Whereas these people, because of the various different biases introduced by this reality distortion field, this time difference error, actually ended up becoming very pessimistic and just wanted to not play the game at all. Right. So they basically said, no, minimum. And they ended up losing the most. So.
All right, this is a little off topic here, but to me, when I see this type of setup, it matches into some things I've kind of thought about before. You might characterize as behavioral health outcomes.
Yes. I went for a walk and I felt great. I went for another walk and I felt great. I'll keep going for walks. Yeah.
Or more generally, I take this medication because it helps prevent me feeling bad.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not feeling bad now, so why should I take the medication?
Yeah.
So I guess, man, I've been trying to think about how to take some of these sort of health issues and behavioral health issues and replicate them in a meaningful way in sort of an RL type framework.
I think this is an excellent starting point.
And yeah, we're starting to get close here.
Yeah, I agree.
Does that make sense to you, Rose?
Yeah, it does. I guess I'm stuck on something and I don't know if I have the words to express it, but I'll give it a shot. This idea of the a priori structures of people and what they're, regardless of the rules of the game, I think certain people are predisposed before the game ever starts to come into it with a particular view of the world. Mm-hmm. And I think what this shows us is that very quickly, the feedback loop happens, right? And that feedback loop gets exaggerated as time goes on.
Mhm.
And the piece that's not explored here is that piece of like, before the game even starts, has the fallout already happened before the game even started?
I don't think it's a very good question. I don't think they explore it in the paper, to be honest. I understand what you're asking. And very little emphasis is placed on a priori conditioning of the agents.
So the reason I'm bringing this up right now, Rob, is to answer your question, is that my feeling with health stuff is that there's a whole bunch of stuff that has gone before the particular issue that we're talking about right now, right? Or the particular issue that you're trying to solve at this moment in time, be it take this medication or treating this condition or something else. And that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like you see these patients that are the most complex patients, and they are the ones who have everything going on. Like when you look at the profile of those patients, they have pretty much every disease that is a chronic disease, right? And so that tells me that there's something much more basic going on. It's not, I don't think we're ever going to solve the problem with approaching it as a single. I feel like there's something with the a priori structures that need to be reset before the game even begins. Do you understand what I'm?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, you could basically have, two versions of this diagram, if you will. And, your a priori position, or whatever you want to call it, might determine which one of those two diagrams you go into.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could have more of them.
Right, yes.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if you can identify who you are and understand, like, well, this is this kind of person, that you
Right.
present them with different.
Yeah, so you could
Yeah.
have a test, we could construct a test that they could go through that would allow us to kind of approximate their mapping function, their time, their TD error, if you whatever you want to call it, yes. And then we could essentially apply an inverse of that to try and get at the underlying utility function, or come up with a series of regimes that are cooked, are baked, that might be able to essentially lead them, even if temporarily, into a more rational disposition, and then challenge them to make decisions once they've established something that's a little bit more rational.
Right, right.
That might work. So you might actually say, okay, we've determined that you've had a very bad run up at this point and you're very pessimistic. Okay, let's see if we can move you into a mood of being, less pessimistic, or at least neutral, and then but can conduct the experiment at that point.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that I'm sort of thinking about is that the winners of the game want to continue to be the winners of the game.
They're endowed, yes.
And they can start to change the presentation of reality so that it takes agency away from the losers of the game.
Yeah. So you're talking about economic and
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, try and elaborate on that. What do you mean?
So I guess what I'm thinking is that let's talk more in like financial terms instead of health terms. So we have a system where there are winners and losers, right?
Okay.
And the winners now have found out how to maximize the utility function. And they like it like that, right? And the only way they can continue to win is by having losers. And so instead of making it clear to everybody, the way to win this game is by doing this, if we start to tell people the way to win this game is to play safe and accept any job that you're given and work hard and work your way up, right? For example, there's a reality distortion going on there, right? Where not everybody is understanding the rules of the game as they really are, right? We start to project a different set of rules that stops the losers from becoming winners.
Yeah, that makes sense. I suppose one way to characterize it is it a zero-sum game collectively?
So I guess that's exactly it. Can it not be a zero-sum game? But if anybody, this is kind of back to the prisoner's dilemma, right? If the winners of the game start to view it as a zero-sum game, then it becomes a zero-sum game.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I would I can see lots of applications of that. But I can also see lots of applications where it's not. I mean, if you're feeling better from some healthcare intervention, that doesn't mean I'm feeling worse.
No, absolutely. That's why I was saying the healthcare one is hard to, I mean, we could get into it with the financial aspect of the health industry too, but one of the things that sort of struck me was the sort of profiles, the risk profiles, right? And that the fact that in this study, they're showing that 41%, even when it's a fair game, lean a little bit pessimistic. And that kind of comes down to it's the assumption of good intention, right? If you're going into it like, and you just like, no, this is too good to be true from the very beginning, right? And I think maybe as a society, and perhaps for very good reason, related to the previous point I was making, we've lost the assumption of good intention.
So Popper's view on that is that it's not a zero-sum game and that everybody is in fact winning. But he also points out that envy is the problem, right? If I walk into a room and everyone's got a Maserati and I've only got a Porsche.
Yeah, I mean, we can also have
that's the problem of context, right? Well, look at Bill Gates. He's got so much money. Dude, you're making 5 times more money than you were 20 years ago. You have a better quality of life. You have better health, blah, 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 blah. This is Popper's argument, not mine. Please, don't hit me. But if you read what is it? Something or other now, whatever it is, Transcendence Now, whatever it is, his new book. He basically makes the claim similar to the better nature of our angels, whatever it is, that we are all actually getting wealthier than we were, and we have access to more stuff than we've ever had in the past, more cheaply, more efficiently. And he's right, I'm not arguing, but we always feel like the world is unfair and that it's a ripoff and I'm being badly treated because agents that do that end up doing better than agents that don't.
Here's a nice illustration of that point. In the time I spent at the SEC, I was involved in sort of a number of, insider trading, market manipulation cases. And they generally had one common feature, all these cases. And that is that participant A in the process was complaining about participant B because they made more money than they did.
Yeah. It's not fair.
Yeah, right. So this guy cheated and he made more money than me.
It's not fair. I should be the one who's making more money. Then it's fair.
I guess I feel like there's a piece of me that understands that argument, but I also feel like there are systemic things in place that stop a certain segment of people from moving beyond where they are. And that because I think that maybe if there was once the feedback loop has started, I think it's really hard to bring it back into a state of balance. Right, because then it comes down to all that stuff of education opportunities and
Right. Yeah. So I think this algorithm is capturing what you're talking about, which is the very next, well, it's the very next slide in the thing, right? So we initialize the state, right? And so that would be this wonderful situation where everyone starts off equal, right? And then it begins, then we start the induction process, right? And when we start the induction process, we start laying down memories of, oh, I'm a winner or I'm a loser, right? And that essentially cumulatively further distorts our view of the world. And we end up being trapped in a I can't take any risk situation, because we're essentially in a mood of giving up, right? Oh, you know, I tried making money in the stock market and I lost. I'm never going to go back. You know? And so you're conditioned into not taking certain actions that would be to your benefit based on bad luck or bad circumstance. And I'm not suggesting that those who have tons of resources wouldn't use a significant amount of those resources to make sure that they retain their resources. That's not my point. But just through sheer random bad luck or good luck, you can essentially accumulate a TD error that leads you to having a risk profile that is successful or unsuccessful, just through sheer luck. Yeah. So, right, so we initialize and then we start the clock ticking, and then we say at this time, choose an action randomly, you know, using the proper policy, and then based on your past experience in that situation, which is what this N represents. Oh, I've been here before. You know, I tried to make money on the stock market 4 times. I've been here before. N equals 4, and I've had a negative outcome. If I go back there, then because I've been in that state before and I've had a bad outcome, I'm greatly distorting the underlying process due to my own experience. And there's nothing we can do about that, really, unless we can try and condition them back into being more optimistic or forgetting the past or something. But those things are very hard to do. So, yeah. So,
it is a pity that Robin isn't here, because I think he has done a lot of the stuff with behavioral health stuff.
okay.
He has a system working, behavioral health related.
Oh, I'd be very curious to see that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a pity he's not here.
Well, yeah, okay, we'll revisit this then. To be
Yeah, maybe directly ping him.
Yeah, I will. Okay. So I just want to kind of bring this to the end of my summary, and then we can carry on. This is the fMRI data, and they've essentially identified these 2 areas that correlate very, very strongly with the behavioral responses of the agents trained using the Kahneman and Tversky prospect theory TD error curve. And they found a very high correlation between human and agent behavior. Pretty interesting. And then we already talked about this, but yeah, so we've already talked about this, so I won't drag you through that again. All right. So this is their summary, not mine. I'll just read it out. As a proof of principle for the applicability of the new framework, we apply it to quantify human behavior in a sequential investment task. We find that the risk-sensitive variant provides a significantly better fit to behavioral data, and that it leads to an interpretation of the subject's responses, which is indeed consistent with prospect theory. The analysis of simultaneously measured fMRI signals show a significant correlation of the risk-sensitive TD error with the bold signal changes in the ventral striatum. In addition, we find significant correlation in the risk-sensitive Q values with neural activity in the striatum, cingulate cortex, and insula, which is not present in standard if the standard Q values are used. Yeah, So they're basically saying that whenever we create agents that we want to behave like humans, we have to map their value functions through the Cantor-Tversky prospect theory curve. And that there's strong evidence for doing that, which is completely relevant to what I'm trying to do, which is to model human behavior in agents. So it's very relevant to me. But I think that you've tapped on a very interesting idea there, Rose, which is this idea of essentially trying to come up with games that can try and counteract unlucky conditioning. Right? Can we have a therapy for somebody who is not going to take the COVID vaccine that leads them to have a more neutral view? Like, can they play a game or something where the underlying utility has been distorted to try and, like a medical intervention, introduce a positive bias that has a positive outcome for that person? Could such games be considered medical treatment?
Mm-hmm.
Don't know.
The answer to that question is definitely. One of the companies that does this is called Pear Therapeutics.
Okay.
And that's essentially their market niche. They're focusing more on kind of like depression type issues. But the results from their clinical experiments are pretty interesting. So they go through, and I haven't actually gone through their treatments, but it looks to be pretty positive.
You know what I'm thinking about with this too is something that I struggle with medical research, etc., is that it's so normative, and this is giving us a way to categorize a little bit more. So what I take away from this paper is that if you are more open to taking risks, you're probably going to come out of the situation a little bit better, right? You have to be open to taking risks. Yet at the same time, all of our research and our structures are defined around a normative, not going to the edges in any way, right? And that seems very contradictory. That what we almost need to be doing is, the people who are in the middle are probably okay, but the most risk averse, we need to be finding a way to find an entry path for them that is not in the normative distribution. Clearly already their a priori structures do not fall into the normative.
Well, that's discrimination, Rose.
Yeah, okay, but sure. I mean, this actually gets back to this other point about sort of the relation between the degree of risk aversion and the degree of willingness to take risk to search in an RL framework.
Yeah.
So
that was your comment that you sent me on an email, Rob. So I
yeah,
go through that. It's very good.
So, you know, I think what we can see from that is that there's probably going to be a negative correlation between, or I don't know if you want to call it negative or positive, but essentially, if you're in the bad draw, you're probably going to be more risk averse because the consequences of a bad outcome for you are probably going to be greater than the consequences of a bad outcome for someone in the positive draw. Consequently, what that's going to do is that's going to make you less likely to search, which basically means increasing the risk.
You'll end up at some suboptimal place and you'll stay there.
Yeah, but from an RL perspective, this is important because folks like that would wind up in one path and they would kind of you know, in your terminology, Rose, it'd sort of be stuck there.
Mhm.
And folks who you have this willingness to take risks, search more, are going to wind up with another path.
Mhm. So I'm thinking about this again in terms of these highly complex patients. And we have normative research that has tested medication on a more general population, right? A hand-selected population that does not include older people, does not include highly complex patients, right? Yet the very people who end up taking these interventions most often are highly complex, and the feedback loop starts, right? And so the interventions not only are not effective, but also every intervention comes with some side effect, right? If you're changing the system, there is something else going on there. And so we start to degrade into this situation where the chances of turning things around for people, it does become hopeless.
Well, okay. I mean, this is part of, I think, of the advantage I have as somebody like me looking at the medical research area, because I mean, I don't see patients. I don't have to, I mean, I don't have to really pay attention to anything I don't want to pay attention to.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I'd look at this and then say, oh, well, okay, so then this is not if the dimensionality of the problem is too high to try and get some interesting results, we got to simplify that. So we got to take the process back and let's look at, you know, 40-year-olds who, you know, may be developing hypertension. You know, kind of let's move the underlying sample back to something that we can kind of abstract from some of those levels of complexity.
So you're saying simplify the problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
We are simplifying the problem in our minds. And so I would suggest that Rob's argument is actually a good one, in that we don't have separate neurological processes for every given situation, and bad luck in one scenario may actually lead to general pessimism overall, even though it has nothing to do with your health, right? If you are in a mood of pessimism, then that persists across all action space, across all activities, not just the game you're playing. I think that that's plausible. So I think that trying to isolate a particular game, if you will, or a particular subpopulation that has a particular profile, a risk profile.
So Rob, I think what you're saying then is, like, what I would take away from that is that we need new research looking at a simpler version of the problem and trying to change the intervention based upon that. But coming back to what I was saying earlier about the winners of the system basically wanting to hang on, that's never going to happen, because pharmaceutical companies want to sell more and more medications, right?
Mhm.
And so they're not very motivated to try and get in there earlier. And
I don't know. It may be true. It may be a little more subtle than that too. So suppose what they're, you know, you could represent it as trying to introduce certain treatment regimens earlier. So in that sense, it's sort of an expansion of the market.
If you believe that will work, I guess I
Yeah,
don't believe that will work. I think that by the time you get to the point of having to take interventions for chronic diseases, you're already on in a feedback loop. right?
Okay, so yeah.
The actions that needed to be taken.
Okay, so somehow would have to walk back earlier.
Mhm.
And basically then the problem becomes, can we predict those who are going to have chronic problems at time t plus k? And then figure out where it is we need to start doing something.
So agent simulation might be able to help answer that question.
I mean, I've always thought it'd be a really interesting study to figure out how to predict who's going to wind up with a certain type of cancer.
Okay, so but what are the inputs to that? Is it their DNA, or is it their life story, or is it their personal experience? Is it where they live? All of the above?
I would say it's probably DNA and environmental. But that's just me. I mean, I'm just sitting here at a desk in Indiana, so I don't know.
I mean, I think that's the problem, right? Is we don't know, right? There are different bodies of pod.
There's more to it. Would you agree that there's more to it than DNA?
Yeah, hold on a sec. No. All right, so see you in a bit. Yeah, like I said, this is sort of both the good side and the bad side. We've kind of wandered off from David's agenda here, but I just get really frustrated with medicine because, it's kind of like the story of the drunk trying to find his keys. Well, I'm looking under the lamppost because, if they were in some dark area, I couldn't see it. All right, so, my solution is, okay, let's go get a lantern. Let's go get a flashlight. Let's start exploring these other alternatives. And I mean, the guys in medicine I talk to are just sort of like, oh, geez, you must be from Mars.
I think it's just harder than you realize in the clinical setting. And it's also it's more depressing because it does come down almost to this pessimism that the game is stacked from such an early stage. And if it was as simple as like identifying the DNA or something like that, but it's not.
Yeah, no, that well, I don't know if people have really done that right yet either.
I mean, a ton of resources has gone into this, and what they're finding is that it's so much harder. Like, I think there was a belief maybe 15, 20 years ago that, oh my God, this is great. As soon as we've got all this map, we're going to be able to see it. And it's like that whole GWASC step and whatever, they've come up with so little at the end of it where it's like, oh, this equals this. It's just more complicated than that. And I think the school of thought right now is that epigenetics is playing a much bigger role than we ever realized. And with the majority of health conditions that consume the most resources, they're chronic conditions that have come about. I don't think it's just DNA, right? It's hard. These are hard problems. They're hard problems to solve. So
yeah, so this is sort of, like I said, it's my orientation, and it's in part, I don't know, probably bordering on arrogance.
I guess that what I would say to you is,
but
I don't disagree with you, but it's just harder and messier than you can ever possibly realize when you're in the clinical setting. And I think it's a really good example of a lot of the things we've been talking about lately, where the a priori structures become such a huge part of the game. And medicine is about manipulating these structures that are in there that actually have, in my opinion, very little to do with root causes of what makes people healthy or unhealthy. We're moving around ICD codes and you know,
Mhm.
even lab measures that we're changing, we take a medication, we change this thing, but does it really change the underlying thing, or has it just disrupted the system? It's messy and it's disheartening.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question to kind of think about medicine and step back and say, okay, what are the real sources of progress? And, you know, at some level, you know, it's probably kind of like you said, small iterations. You know, let me try this, let me try that, let me kind of see what works, what doesn't.
I mean, I think there have been huge advances in a lot of the cancer stuff.
Yeah, but that's probably, you know, in surgery in general. You know, okay, let me try cutting here versus there.
Yeah. But the biggest problems that are actually the true issues that we need to be solving are around chronic conditions. Like those are the things that consume the most resources.
Yeah.
And they're also the things that make it more difficult to fix the bigger problems later, right? It's kind of like the COVID stuff, right? The people who have these chronic conditions are at such a higher risk for something like that. Whereas if we're all, you know, relatively healthy, these things, it becomes easier to deal with them.
Yeah.
So I think you're right in that the going back and trying to simplify the problem and start to identify where the feedback loop starts is a great approach. But how do you do that, and what data do you feed into that?
I don't know. I remember at one time I was having back issues and wound up going through a number of orthopedic guys. And at one point I talked to one of them and said, you know, has anybody ever done a study of people who sort of have these abnormalities but don't have back pain? The guy just looked at me like, damn, never thought of that.
No, they have done those studies. And they've
Yeah, I know
shown
that.
it. Yeah, they've shown that there's actually like
Surprisingly little correlation.
Yes, that's what I'm saying about like the structures that are put in place. We basically validate some idea that we've come up with, and then we create this a priori structure around it, and then we manipulate those things within it. But a lot of the time it's not doing anything for the underlying condition.
Yeah, we don't necessarily know what the right things to play with are either.
So the right things to play with, right, at the most basic level are things like diet, exercise, managing stress, right? Managing
That's where I start, yeah.
Like providing people with homes and jobs and right? Like those are the things that will have the biggest impact, but those are not, they're not sexy, they're not lucrative, right? Like it basically comes down to the players, the big players who own the system or own parts of the system. They're not very motivated to change the system.
And that's reflected in the Kahneman-Tversky prospect theory thing, right? Even at 50-50 odds, we are conservative. Right? We don't take the risk.
Right.
All right, so my yeah, we're running over.
So guys, I'm sorry, it's 10:33 and I'm gonna have to go, but I would love to continue the discussion. And I think if you can get Robin, like
I'll try. I'll reach out to Robin and see if I can have a one-on-one with him and get him to watch this video.
He's done a lot of this. He's implemented some amount of this stuff already, and I think he would be a great person to talk to about this.
So I'll take that on and let's call it that. But wonderful discussion. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for presenting that, David. It was very interesting.
Yep. Cool. Thanks,
Very
David.
good. All right.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.